Chapter 2 Arroyo. Land wasn't worth much in the arroyo bottom. There was quite a lot of it, too, because, in some places, the arroyo was almost a quarter of a mile wide, and ran in a generally southern direction from the big mountains to the north on down past the Rose Bowl and under the curving Colorado Street Bridge and on until it lost itself, twisting down into the northeastern section of Los Angeles, where, somewhere, it joined the Los Angeles River bottom and wasn't the arroyo anymore. Ben had been tramping toward the city of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels, and one day the Foothill Boulevard became the business section of Pasadena, and he continued on Colorado Street until he found himself on the paraboloidal Colorado Street Bridge. He walked to the middle of the bridge and stopped. The constant hum and whiz of eastbound and westbound automobiles did not annoy him. He turned his back on them and looked to the north toward the San Gabriels a few miles away, from the canyons of which range the arroyo began. Then he looked below. There were a few houses in the bottom, but not many. Some trees and some gardens, and grass too. It was pleasant down there. On the bluffs that formed the east and west borders of the arroyo were homes, typically California homes, mostly white stucco with red tile roofs, some of them partially hidden in eucalyptus trees, pepper trees, jacaranda, and acacia trees. Homes in which Ben decided rich people lived. Well, pretty rich. Rich enough, anyway. He had $2.15 in his trouser pocket. You could be rich on that if you knew how. Not very rich, but rich enough anyway. Back the way he had come lay Pasadena. Onward the road would take him into Los Angeles, but below were gardens and grass. September in Southern California isn't usually too cool. You couldn't freeze, but even if it should be cool, it would probably be warm down there. It would be nice to stay down there somewhere. The sun was over in the west. What was the use in trudging on into noisy Los Angeles? When you're 62 years old, you can't hoof it as briskly as some of these younger fellows. The arroyo looked pretty nice. He'd be sure to find some spot to crawl into. He'd go down and see anyway. He put his right hand inside his shirt and felt the sleek, warm body of the tame rat. It wriggled against his stomach, resting in the balloon of his shirt over his belt and trouser top. He could feel its bristling whiskers and occasionally its sharp nails dug into his sides as it braced itself within the shirt. That might be a good place down there, he said, aloud, but the roar of the passing traffic over the Colorado Street Bridge kept him from hearing his own words. "We'll go down and see," he declared. "That's what we'll do, go see for ourselves." He walked on across the bridge to its western end, where he found a road that curved around and down toward the arroyo bottom, and came out on the floor of the arroyo, almost under the spans of the bridge. 6 stories above him, the abutments merged into the elevated highway that crossed the arroyo. You could still detect the roar of the traffic, but it seemed remote. This was a little place, in the middle of the world, and yet quite out of it. You were far away, and yet in a few steps you could walk up and be right back in it again. There was something secure about it, pleasant. The foliage was thick down here too, almost lush. Grass, bushes, trees, and just a little beyond, a few small houses and gardens. "Isn't it nice down here?" Ben asked. He put his hand into his shirt to see if there might be any kind of answer. He fancied the whiskers twitched, but then he told himself he was making it up. The rat didn't really understand anything. People went crazy sometimes when they began to think their animals talked to them. He wasn't crazy. Oh, of course, it understood some things. You could easily see that, but not words. He knew it didn't understand words. He would be foolish to pretend that it did. "Let's walk up this way," he said aloud. And so they strolled northward, moving into a more oblate part of the arroyo bottom, and passing the Rose Bowl, which mystified Ben, as it was obviously not a municipal building or a reservoir. Then he realized it was a stadium. "They play games there," he explained. "Football and such. Don't you know what a football is?" Ahead, the arroyo took on something of its former aspect. Soon there was a section which was chaparral, thick bushes about as high as a man's head, or a little higher, scrub oak, weeds, even a little prickly pear cactus. This uncleared section was over close to the east bluff, so that some of the houses on the bluff afforded a view below to the chaparral, covered bottom, as well as a view to the west, where the other bluff was almost a quarter of a mile away. "We like this place, don't we?" Ben asked his shirt front, and after a moment he assured himself with "yes indeedy." He stopped and looked around. Mary Sunshine would have liked it too. Course, you never knowed her. You wasn't even born. Shadows were crawling across the floor of the arroyo as the sun hit the rim of the western bluff and began to sink behind a hilly residential district, with a sign set against the hills, which spelled out in large letters, "Flint Ridge." As he stood, he could hear voices, and then a tap, and following the tap a clink, then the voices again. Above the screen of chaparral, a few yards farther on, a red flag was raised. There was a white 6 on the flag, and whoever raised it had stuck the pole bearing it into the ground, for now the flag flapped a time or two in the waning sunlight, and the unseen voices faded away. "What was all that?" Ben asked. He patted the outside of his bulging shirt, and moved into the chaparral, following a plain trail still northward. A few paces more, and the chaparral gave way to the landscaped ground on the left. There was a patch of close-cropped bright green grass. On 3 sides of the green were bunkers and sand traps, and on the 4th was the chaparral through which Ben peered. "Golf," said Ben. "That's what." There came a whir and a whack from the 7th tee, not far off. This was followed by another whir and a whack, and then 2 men came into view, walking away from Ben, toward the club house across the arroyo. "They think that's fun," Ben explained to his shirt front. He watched them walk until one of them stopped and took his stance. After a few seconds, he raised a club and struck the unseen ball. The men were too far away now for any audible whir and whack. Presently the man's companion went through the same procedure, and then they walked on and were almost indistinguishable. "And maybe it is," said Ben. "You've got to get used to it, that's all. Just get used to it, and it's fun." The trail through the chaparral skirted the 6th green, and then veered northeast. Ben followed it, content to walk a little farther since this exploration had proved interesting. Here the undergrowth was thicker than before. The trail followed a small sandy gully, and a few seconds later he came upon a one-room shack. At the same instant he was conscious of movement. Somebody or something had scooted into the shack. Somebody or something had heard him coming along the trail and brushing by the bushes the second before he had appeared. In the dim interior of the shack, somebody or something was peering out at him, moving slightly but making no sound. The shack was made of odds and ends of lumber, and it leaned precariously to one side. In one wall there was an opening which served as a casement. A cracked piece of glass, only half the size of the opening, partially formed a window. There was some kind of stove inside, for a battered stovepipe pushed through the flat roof. A glimpse in the open doorway showed the shack to be lined with old newspapers, and the vague form within moved further back as Ben walked to the entrance and looked around with interest and admiration. Set in the sand on each side of the doorway were 2 green glass bottles. Bits of broken glass had been arranged beside the bottles. One series of pieces outlined the form of a heart, and another series made an arrow. On the wall of the shack, where a doorbell would have been had there been a doorbell, was the bleached skull of a small animal, a gopher or a squirrel. Over the doorway a hawk's wing had been spread and tacked. From a tiny crater in the sand, a parade of ants hurried into the shack, and the returning force, carrying some plunder back to the crater, stopped momentarily for antennae contact with the incoming horde. Ben surveyed the immediate environs with appreciation. Above, on the bluff, were the homes of the well-to-do, and here in the chaparral of the arroyo bottom was the home of a not-so-well-to-do. Something like this, after all, was just about what he had been half hoping to find. He had been looking for a place where he might feel entirely at ease. "Sure looks like the house of an artist," said Ben. "Don't it?" He stepped back in order to see it altogether as an entity, and something moved within the shack, and a figure came to the doorway. At first it wasn't a man, but a second glance proved that it was. He wasn't quite 5 feet tall, and wore dirty dungarees and a ragged coat. He held his hands before his breast, clenching and unclenching his stubby fingers, and stared querulously at Ben. "Build it yourself?" asked Ben. The tenant opened his mouth to speak, but the mental answer was ahead of articulation, and for a second his open mouth showed that all his front teeth were missing. Then the words came, and he said in a high-pitched voice, "Me? Yes." He stood in the doorway, ill at ease, picking at a wart on the back of a hand, and watching Ben with timid interest. "Right nice," said Ben critically. "Yes, indeedy." "Travellin'?" asked the tenant with a squeak. "Some," said Ben. "I used to, now I ain't." "Others live around here?" asked Ben. "Gosh, yes," the tenant said. "Heavy's here. No heavy?" "No," said Ben. "Tex?" "Lots of boys get named Tex," said Ben. "I've knowed 3 or 4. This Tex is a young'un. Maybe I don't know him," said Ben. "How long you had this house?" "Long time." "Year?" "No, gosh, I don't know, maybe." "Don't mind if I set down for a spell, do you?" "Gosh, no." "I got some victuals here," said Ben, "and I allowed as how I'd rest here maybe." "They come and go," said the man in the doorway. "Yes," said Ben, sitting down on the sand a few feet from his host. "A fellow named Buck. He came and then he went." "Yes," said Ben. He unrolled his sack and spread it on the sand, segregating the contents and examining piece by piece. There was some bread and cheese, and an apple. From a pocket Ben brought a jackknife and began to peel the apple, concentrating on the job in order to keep the peel as thin as possible. His friend watched. "What do they call you?" Ben asked. "Me? Gosh." "Gosh?" "Yeah." They both concentrated as the apple described a slow revolution in Ben's hand, and a shred of peel hung into space. "I'm Ben." Gosh said nothing, but he continued to watch the peel. With the apple half pared, Ben held it up and examined it carefully. Gosh left the doorway and squatted down on the sand near Ben. "Looks like a right pretty piece of fruit," he piped. Ben held it at arm's length and looked at it critically, his head on one side, either because he was far-sighted or in order to benefit by the last rays of the fading twilight. He held it high in the direction of Gosh. Gosh swallowed. "Sweet and juicy," said Ben. "I got some coffee," said Gosh. "Yes," said Ben. "I got cheese here and bread." "Coffee for the apple," said Gosh. "Well," Ben hesitated, "maybe." "I'll get it started," said Gosh, crawling to his feet. He began to make a fire in a small pit, protected by a few bricks. It was dark when they ate supper, bread, cheese, coffee, and fruit to finish off. The rat was an innovation. At first, Gosh was afraid of it. He said that rats bit sometimes, but Ben explained that they only bit when they were concerned and frightened. This one was a trained rat. Gosh watched while Ben fed it bread and cheese. He was interested, but he wouldn't touch it, and if it moved in his direction, he whimpered and crawled away. They had almost finished eating when they heard somebody approaching along the trail in the dark. Then they heard voices, and a moment later 2 forms came out of the darkness and passed before Gosh's shack. One was large, and one was middle-sized. Gosh said, "That's Heavy and Tex." "Hi, Gosh," called Heavy. "Heavy scooped a leg of lamb," said Tex. "Oh, baby, who's that?" asked Heavy, seeing the outline of Ben's form. "Ben," said Ben. "He just come," said Gosh. "Okay," said Heavy. "It was stickin' out of a parked car," said Tex. "He did it as easy as nothin'." "We're gonna cook it," said Heavy. "Keep movin', Heavy," said Tex. They passed by following the trail on north, disappearing at once, in the darkness, into a section of the chaparral that Ben had not yet visited. The fire went down, and Gosh made no attempt to keep it going. He and Ben sat on the sand before the shack and watched the embers die out. Once in a while the 2 men spoke, but often a quarter of an hour would go by between sentences. "Where do you get your water?" asked Ben. "There's a spigot," said Gosh. Ben nodded, but in the darkness Gosh couldn't see the acknowledgement, and there was silence again. A gentle breeze blowing down from the north carried the odor of cooking meat. "They'll give us some tomorrow," said Gosh. "Maybe." "How many boys are here?" asked Ben. "Just them and us, but they come and go all the time," said Gosh. "Gosh, yes," said Ben. "But it ain't a jungle," said Gosh emphatically. "Heavy says it ain't a jungle, it's different. It's a camp." "Sure," said Ben. "There ain't many here at once," Gosh explained. "Not like a jungle, like a camp," said Ben. "Yes," said Gosh. After a long silence, Gosh yawned and said, "I'm going to sleep." "Me too," said Ben. "Inside is best," said Gosh. "In the morning it gets wet out here." "You got a little box or a paper bag?" asked Ben. "Why, he likes a little box or a paper bag to sleep in," said Ben. "Who?" "Him," said Ben. "Oh," said Gosh, "I got a cardboard box." "He likes that," said Ben, "but he don't like it with a top on." Gosh went in the shack, and Ben waited in the doorway. In a moment Gosh struck a match and lit a candle. Ben was surprised to see that on a broken table were 6 golf balls. "I find 'em," said Gosh. "Sometimes I sell 'em." "This do?" "Yeah, that's a good box," said Ben. "That's where I sleep," said Gosh, indicating a pile of gunny sacks in a corner. "Ain't much room in here. I'll fix my bed out of a coat," said Ben, "like this." He folded his coat and laid it on the sandy soil. The shack had no floor. Gosh's preparations for the night exceeded simplicity. He lay down on his bed of gunny sacks and blew out the candle. Ben stood for some time in the doorway. The denseness of the chaparral made the night seem darker than it actually was. Overhead the sky was full of stars. Ben could distinguish at last that bunch of little ones, by which he meant the Pleiades. The smell of cooking meat no longer hung in the air. Occasionally the sound of distant automobiles could be heard, and by stretching his neck he could see lights in some of the houses above, on the bluff. Slowly he drew the rat from within his shirt and put it in the cardboard box. Gosh's rhythmical breathing indicated sleep. Ben was tired too. He lay down on his coat just within the doorway and pulled the loose end of the garment over one shoulder. The cardboard box he put in the crook of one elbow. With his other hand he slowly scratched the rat's back. He'd had worse beds than this. After a few minutes he slept. The sun had not been up long the next day before Ben felt at home in the chaparral. A little exploring, and then he was familiar with it all. There was perhaps the length of 3 city blocks of scrub oak and underbrush extending from the 6th green of the golf club northward until this forest came to an abrupt end before the concrete wall of the Devil's Gate Dam, which rose straight into the air 6 stories high. Beyond the concrete was a lake of water, and there was a spillway which had been known to overflow in the spring of the year when the dam was filled by torrents from the mountains. But none of the men of the arroyo bottom could recall a time when it had actually spilled over. None of them had been there that long. Gosh didn't even know that it was a dam. He thought it was just another bridge, like the Colorado Street Bridge to the south. Only this was a bridge that had solid underpinning instead of arched abutments. He even argued that it was a bridge because high above on its flat surface, automobiles crossed back and forth, just as they crossed the Colorado Street Bridge. When Ben said he had discovered that it was both a bridge and a dam, Gosh was content to let it go at that. After all, it was of no particular interest to anybody. It just was, that's all. The chap named Buck, who had come and gone, according to Gosh's brief account, interested Ben especially. If Buck had lived for a while in the arroyo, he must have had some kind of quarters, and before noon of the first morning in the arroyo, Ben found them, 3 walls of a shack, with a 4th wall caved in, and a roof collapsed, a litter of tin cans, some garbage, and a few rags, that had been Buck's residence. It was only a few yards north from Gosh's house, and now it was abandoned, and falling to pieces, and begging for somebody to fix it up. Accordingly, Ben began to fix it. There was no hurry about it. He would do a little work at a time. First, the 4th wall had to be made secure, and the roof had to be fastened down. It didn't have to be too well done, as Ben wasn't sure just how long he would stay. If he should take a notion to move on, it would be foolish to have expended a great deal of energy on this shack. Then there was the problem of getting enough to eat. The arroyo might be a nice place to live in, but so was the desert, if you could find some way to eat. Of course, there were a lot of rich folks' homes adjacent, and you could always go to the back door and say you were hungry. You could always get something by that simple, direct way, only it was bad for repeats, and if you tried it at the same house a 3rd time, they usually turned you down. Funny about that, 3 different men could go to the same house on 3 successive days, and all 3 would get some kind of handout. But just go there 3 days in succession yourself, and see what happens. The house would give away the same amount of food, but for some inexplicable reason, it never wanted to give it to the same man again. Ben had discussed the fact once with a stranger in Bakersfield, and once with a friend in Peoria. Nobody seemed to be able to account for it. Ben finally attributed it to human nature and dismissed it, but it was never a really satisfactory explanation. Funny thing, how you ate really depended upon the type of community in which you found yourself. You wouldn't make the same kind of effort here that you would if you were staying in the neighborhood of the Union Rescue Mission on Main Street in Los Angeles. In a place like this, you could putter and tinker. When you knocked at a back door and they asked you what you wanted, you explained that you could cut grass, or wipe off a car, or fix screens, or wash windows, and best of all, you could tinker. You could fix anything that was broken. Locks, tools, faucets, almost anything. That was the system to use in a neighborhood like this. The chances looked pretty good, and the prospect proved itself. The second day after Ben came to the arroyo, he asked for work at a house on the bluff about 2 blocks to the south, and was given the job of repairing a leaky garden hose. The rotten part had to be cut out, and the joints spliced with a makeshift turnbuckle, and the job took 3 hours, and earned 75 cents. It was pleasant work, too. If that sort of thing kept on, he might stay here for 2 or 3 months, or longer. He never could tell for sure when it would be nice to move on. After all, it's the weather that makes you make up your mind. You don't have to lay awake nights making any plans. You'll know when you feel like moving. And there were pretty nice men here too. That Gosh, he wasn't very bright, but he was all right. Sold used golf balls sometimes. Not very good business, though. Young Tex was just a youngster, a good-natured squirt who never worried much and grinned a lot and spit blood. Funny thing, whenever he got excited, or sometimes for no reason at all, there was a place in his mouth that would bleed and he'd go spitting it out. Never bothered him any. You got so you didn't notice it, and it always stopped after a little while. Tex said it was because he was tough. He came from one of the border towns, down along the Rio Grande. But he'd been around a lot, and he told a lot of tales. Lies, maybe, can't tell. A kid is like that, and he'll make up a tale out of nothing, just to show off, and brag a little, kid-like. Like the time he told of beating up 3 Mexicans in Villa Acuna. Got beat up himself, like as not, and told it t'other way around. Nice kid, though. Had freckles. Handy around a grocery store, too. Whenever he came back to the arroyo with a half-pound of butter in his pants, or some canned milk in his crotch, he'd hand it out and say, "I sure take things easy." Then he'd laugh and spit blood. Them redheads, they're all kinda like that. Can't do nothin' with 'em. Heavy was a good fellow, too. He was the boss. It wasn't his arroyo, it wasn't that, but he kinda oversaw it. And he was right. This was no common jungle. It was an accommodation camp. You might almost say it was a place for gentlemen transients, not for just every old Tom, Dick, and Harry. It was Heavy who jawed Gosh for letting the water run all night out of the spigot on the golf course. Run too much water, and they'll put a lock on it. Heavy was right. Gosh never said nothing back. He just took it settin' down. Now you guys be careful, Heavy said to Ben and Gosh and young Tex. This here's too soft to spoil. Get careless and you'll get run out. And that was right. Somebody had to look out for things, so Heavy did it. This ain't no common jungle, so don't kill it. Then he shut up and went away. But it showed he was the boss, all right. Good boss, too. Gosh turned the spigot off, good and tight, after that. By the time a week had gone by, Ben's house was in respectable shape. It was considered as Ben's place now, and everybody forgot that it used to be Buck's place. Nobody seemed to remember Buck anymore. Not only had Ben made the roof secure and propped the fourth wall up, but he cleared away the weeds and battered cans and rotting garbage and put 2 rows of stones from the door of the shack to the sandy bottom of the gully. Nobody made any comment about it, but Ben thought it looked better than it had before. Sets it off, he thought, but he said nothing about it. The city dump was a long way off. It was too long a walk to take every day, but 2 or 3 times a week Ben made the expeditions over that way, and slowly he began to accumulate property. It was a good dump indeed, with many oddments you wouldn't find in just any dump. You can tell almost everything about a town by its dump if you've got a practiced eye. For instance, there wasn't much manufacturing done here, very little discarded balling wire, hardly any old iron, no copper wire at all, only a few packing cases, hardly any barrel staves, and you had to scratch to find nails. But on the other hand, there were busted bedsteads, worthless radios, but good parts in 'em sometimes, many shoes, newspapers, magazines, tin cans, a hat, a cocktail shaker that leaked, children's toys, a mattress with most of the stuffing gone, an automobile club emblem, a fly swatter, pots and pans, tar paper, bottles, jars, and buckets, 2 dog collars, innumerable objects worth repossessing if you had any ideas of your own, plus a knack at being handy with things. And on one of his return trips, Ben dragged after him a battered baby carriage. "What's eatin' you?" asked Heavy. "Gonna have a baby?" asked Tex. Ben explained that if he took it all apart, it would be valuable. There were rubber-tired wheels and axles, a spring, a handle, a variety of little parts that might be fixed and straightened and used for a number of things. "You can have 'em," said Tex in derision, and he was mildly surprised to see that Ben really wanted them. On another trip, Ben found a discarded bird cage. A fairly good-sized cage, too, and it was quite a prize, for it could be repaired and would make a splendid house for the pet rat. Not only was it practical for this purpose, but Ben was able to make from his growing supply of odds and ends, plus 2 wheels from the baby carriage, a small wire treadmill, which he fastened inside the cage. It afforded the rat great sport to run like fury on the circular mill. "He's just like us," said Tex, as he watched the rat run within the whirling mill. "How?" asked Heavy, watching the performance. "He can go like hell, but he ain't gettin' no place. "He gets exercise," explained Ben, "and he likes it." "He's crazy," concluded Tex, spitting a gob of blood into the cage. "But I ain't got no right to call names. It's better'n workin'," said Heavy. "Let's take a walk into town." "Okay," said Tex. Previous to the acquisition of the bird cage, Ben had to take the rat with him everywhere he went. It might have been frightened and run away if it had been left alone in the arroyo bottom. But now it could remain safely at home, and only occasionally did he take it along on some of his daily prowls, as he became familiar with the city of Pasadena. People had been coming to Pasadena for the mild California winter for years. Now he was one of them. This place bid fair to rival any spot he had ever picked before, except perhaps for that time years ago when he had met Mary Sunshine. A pity she wasn't here now. Why, she'd just fit into this place like it was made for her and all her little peculiarities. Noble woman. He couldn't even remember the name of the town now after all the years, but it was in Pennsylvania somewhere. Of that he was positive, and there was that large hospital-like building over on the hill, and the town dump down in the valley, and the town itself just over yonder. He'd found a fortune in copper wire in that town's dump, almost $7 worth. That had been the first sign that something good was bound to happen. Good things always started slowly, and then came with a rush. Then a few days later, Mary Sunshine had come into his life. A splendid summer that had been. If Mary Sunshine was still alive, and she was certainly a healthy woman in her day, and if he knew what her post office name was, he would send her a little postal card telling her how he was fixed. It would be a picture card of a small white stucco house with roses all around it. "Dear Mary Sunshine, got me a small house out here in Pasadena, surrounded by millionaires and other winter tourists. Rent is dirt cheap, and has private golf course. May stay for the season. If your wings has growed big, fly out and meet me. Respect." Such a postal was not untruthful at all, and who could tell, a woman of Mary Sunshine's ability and genius might have sprouted wings just as she said she would. Stranger things than that have happened, and if everybody laughed when he told about Mary Sunshine, that was only their ignorance. Most people weren't fit to go taking her name in vain. Most people didn't deserve to hear about her. He'd kept her to himself for a long time now, but wouldn't she be happy out here though? Her and her peculiarities. The one drawback to living in the exclusive residential district between Arroyo Drive and Flint Ridge was the fact that it was such a long way from Ben's place of business. It was over 2 miles to the city dump, and that meant more than a 4-mile walk. To do that in the hot sun and carry, say, an awkward object, such as a mattress, with half of the stuffing missing, and the other half falling out, was a tedious job. On one occasion, when Ben had some small change, payment for repairing a meat grinder at a house on Palm Drive the day before. He permitted himself the luxury of a streetcar ride because the streetcar went within a block of the arroyo edge, and it was but a short walk from the end of the line to the trail that led down the bluff and came out next to Gosh's house at the bottom. A week later he allowed himself the indulgence of paid transportation again. This time he had taken the rat with him, and he had hesitated to board the street car because such an unusual event might scare the rat. He was within a few blocks of the end of the line when the car came along, and on an impulse he decided to try it. It wasn't worth a nickel for such a short ride, but it would give him a notion as to the rat's reactions, and after a few blocks they would be off again. As soon as he was on the car, the rattle and clink disturbed the rat, and Ben had to put his right hand inside his shirt in order to smooth the rat's back and reassure it that all was well. He sat down in the forepart of the car, and it was a precarious moment. Then the moment became critical because the conductor came along with the fare collector, and Ben's coins were in his right-hand trouser pocket. There was no way to get the coins out of the right-hand trouser pocket because his right hand was busy inside his shirt. He looked up helplessly, and the conductor was frowning and saying, "If you can't pay, you have to get off." That was one way out of the dilemma he had blundered himself into, and he would have gotten up and walked to the front exit. But just at that moment a little girl, who had been sitting a little further back in the car, had come forward without Ben or the conductor noticing, and she placed a nickel in the fare collector and went back to her seat. That satisfied the conductor, and the crisis was over. Ben hadn't noticed the child before. She was a nice-looking little girl who wore a pink dress and had her hair in 2 braids. After a moment she turned and looked toward him, and he smiled. He wanted her to enjoy the secret now that she was a partner in its execution, and he opened his shirt front slightly, and the rat, fairly calm now, but curious as always, peered out. She would doubtless be surprised and entranced by the sharp little nose and the black eyes and the bristling side whiskers all peering out from a man's shirt front. And indeed she was, for Ben could see her face express surprise, amazement, delight, and screams. Several sharp screams of terror came from 2 lady passengers sitting across the aisle. After that, things happened so fast that Ben scarcely knew the order of events. The car was stopped in the middle of the block, and the conductor was saying something, but in the confusion, Ben didn't hear the words, and a second later, he was thrust off the front platform and sent staggering on the street, almost losing his balance, and when he righted himself, he walked to the curb while the car gave 2 clangs and went on toward Palm Drive. For a moment, all of its passengers were staring out at him, and then the car rolled on, and he sat down on the curb for a minute, just to be sure that the rat was all right, and that no harm had been done by the episode. "We got thrown off," he said. "Now what do you think of that? Thrown off. I declare, something happens every day. Now we'll have to walk." He rose and started toward home. "But 'tain't far, so we don't care. 'Tain't far at all. We got thrown off, we did." It was a matter of no consequence, and he closed his mind to it as he trudged along, turning on to Arroyo Drive, and walking north for a block. He followed his usual route, across the lot to the rear of a garage belonging to a two-story white house, where there was a trail that led to the arroyo bottom. He dropped below, and in a few minutes he was down in the chaparral, past Gosh's shack, and home again at his own place. By that time he had forgotten all about the incident in the streetcar, and he was unaware that he had been observed as he came up Arroyo Drive, and watched from behind a hedge as he crossed the vacant lot, and spied upon from above as he descended the trail until he disappeared into the chaparral. Nor had he any idea that during the next few days his movements coming and going up and down the trail and across the lot and on the adjacent streets were liable to detailed surveillance between the hours of 4 and 6 in the afternoon, and at most any hour on Saturdays. He would have said that nobody paid any attention to him, or displayed the slightest interest in what he did. And he would have been greatly mistaken. Sometimes he was watched from an upstairs window, sometimes from behind a hedge. Several times he was followed on the street. Once he was stared at from a passing Cadillac, which later turned into the private drive of, of the White House with the hedge around it, and of all this he remained ignorant. A week after the incident in the streetcar, he was homeward bound on Palm Drive, when a figure came out from behind a palm tree, only a few steps ahead, and as he came nearer, the figure said, "How do you do?" Ben said, "Why, hello," and walked on, passing the donor of this ostentatious greeting, with no further ado. He noted that she was a little girl, wearing a blue dress and her hair in 2 braids, and carrying some books, school books maybe, in her hands. After a few steps, the little girl in blue recalled the little girl in pink of a week ago, who had tried to be helpful on the streetcar, and of course both little girls were one and the same little girl, and he hadn't recognized her, even though she had recognized him. He stopped and looked back. She was still standing beside the palm tree, and when he turned, she said, "Where is it?" "Him?" he asked. "Yes," she said. A distance of 10 feet separated them. They looked at each other carefully, but neither one stepped nearer. "He's in the house," said Ben. "Has he got a house?" "Yes, indeedy." "Where is his house?" "Down there," said Ben, nodding in the direction of the arroyo. She looked with interest, and Ben smiled and walked on. Now she was certainly a well-brought-up little girl, and must live somewhere nearby, and if he ever happened to see her again, he would be sure to speak nicely to her, because children these days who had good manners should certainly be encouraged. At the end of the block, he looked back. She was still standing beside the palm tree. Once, in Trenton, a gang of boys had hooted at him on the street, and once in Kansas City, some children, both boys and girls, had made fun of him. But this little girl was different, and she was truly a fine type of child. If he had thought of it, he would have returned her nickel. On her part, Virginia had reached some conclusions about him. Never had she heard of a man who had a tame rat. Some people had dogs or cats or birds or goldfish, but this man was the first person she had ever seen who owned a pet rat, and who seemed to take it for granted that owning a pet rat was a normal, commonplace event. Furthermore, he was a remarkable old man. As the days had passed since the incident in the streetcar, she had learned more about him. That he lived in the Arroyo Bottom was a certainty. That he was poor was equally certain. That he worked now and then at odd jobs was obvious. That Mother and Daddy and Celia and Adashi and James knew of his existence was unlikely, even improbable. That he was a nice man was plain to see in his face, and even in the few words he had answered when she waited behind a tree and then popped out and spoke to him. A few days later, they met again. He was alone, but Virginia was walking with Celia, and Celia made a difference. Virginia didn't speak, and Ben didn't speak, but they looked sharply at each other as they passed, and their eyes twinkled, and each knew that the other had smiled inwardly. It was nonetheless a greeting because of an absence of words, but Celia never noticed. After that, to watch for him and follow him and discover more and more about him became a new game, but it was a game limited entirely by geographical boundaries. Once he went down the trail to the Arroyo Bottom, he entered a world she had never known, and down there was the place he spent most of his time, the place where he lived, a strange, mysterious, fascinating place, so near and yet so far. To lean over the garden hedge and peer below was unsatisfactory. All you could see was the dense mass of chaparral, but what went on within the chaparral was something you couldn't guess. Once she had asked Mother, rather casually, so that Mother wouldn't take any especial notice, what was down on the Arroyo Bottom, and Mother had said, sand and underbrush. Later she asked Daddy the same question, and he said, What? What is on the Arroyo Bottom? Oh, just earth and dirt and weeds, I suppose, Daddy said. Celia, when interrogated, had a more positive and enigmatically a more negative answer. Nothing, said Celia. James avoided the issue by saying, Never been down there, and Adashi was the least satisfactory of all. He merely grinned back at you and said, No savvy. So there was no gaining information by questions or by observation. The only way to know what was on the Arroyo Bottom was to go down and take a look for yourself. Once in a while smoke curled up from the chaparral, and once or twice other men used the trail besides the old man who owned the pet rat. When she came to think of it, It was funny that she had never gone down there before, as long as she could remember. The arroyo had always been there, just as Palm Drive had always been there, and the Colorado Street Bridge had always been there. The arroyo had been accepted as a matter of fact, an inevitable thing that you took for granted. But recently, the old arroyo had taken on a new interest. If it was such a commonplace phenomenon that it lacked romance, it certainly had thrown a cloak of mystery about itself, and that mystery had to be solved. Each time since the incident in the streetcar that Virginia had seen Ben, there had been no outward sign of the presence of the rat. He did not seem to be obliged to keep his right hand inside his shirt. When he walked on the street, he swung both hands, provided he wasn't carrying something at his sides, just as any other person might do. Could it be that he didn't carry the rat in his shirt any more? Or did the rat live down in the arroyo and never come up because of the tragic experience in the streetcar? The second Saturday after that initial event, things came to a crisis. 10 days had gone by in which Ben had been watched and followed and spoken to. On this particular Saturday, about noon, he had come along Arroyo Drive from the downtown section, crossed the lot, and taken the trail to the bottom. He hadn't come up by 1 o'clock, but a thin wisp of blue smoke had floated up from the chaparral, indicating some activity below. What was that expression grown-ups sometimes said, "Where there's smoke, there's fire"? Well, somebody had a fire down there, and there was no doubt about that, and little doubt as to who it was. Celia called her to come in from the garden at 1 o'clock to have lunch with Mother. While they had vegetable soup together, Virginia almost asked if she could go down to the arroyo bottom after lunch, but something stopped her in time, for if she asked that, Mother would want to know why she wanted to go to the arroyo bottom, and that would never do because it would be so hard to explain to Mother all the reasons, when Mother didn't know any of them or even know about the strange event which had begun the whole thing 10 days ago. Instead, Virginia said, "If I play in the garden today, can I play in the lot too?" "Yes," Mother said. "Why don't you go see Claire Ensley?" "Maybe I will. I saw Miss Ensley yesterday, and she said Claire had missed you recently." "Has she? You haven't had a quarrel, have you?" "Oh, no, Mother, because Claire is a nice little girl, and it's nice for you to be friends." "Sure," said Virginia. "Surely," said Mother. "Surely," said Virginia. Celia came in with scrambled eggs and tomatoes, and they had the rest of their lunch. And when dessert was over, Virginia returned to the garden. Mother would be home all afternoon, and Daddy would be home early because today was Saturday. But she was free to do anything she pleased. If she went to see Claire Ensley, nobody would be concerned. So if she went down to the arroyo bottom, would it be any different, really, from going to see Claire Ensley? By leaning over the hedge and peering below, she could see that the smoke had stopped rising. Maybe he had come up while she and Mother had been at lunch. If she went down there and looked around, she could come right back up again in a few minutes. It was only because she had never gone down there before that it seemed like such an adventure. Why, think of the places that Boy Scouts went, all over the mountains and the desert. And here she was wondering about walking down a trail that was really part of her own backyard. She stepped over the hedge, scratching her legs against the trimmed branches. Then she walked along the outside edge of the rim of the arroyo until the garage screened her from the house. A few steps farther and she reached the point where her yard ended and the hedge turned at right angles and ran eastwards along the southern edge of the property to Arroyo Drive. Ahead was the vacant lot, and dropping down, switchbacking as it dropped, was the trail that led to the bottom. Nobody was in sight. Below she could see where the trail curved into the chaparral. Beyond that was the mystery. It wouldn't be a mystery much longer. She'd go down there and explore the whole thing. Then she'd come up and tell Mother all about it. Probably Mother had never been down there, and she'd be interested in hearing what it was like. She started down the trail. It was steeper than it looked, and you had to watch your step. If you went too fast, you'd slip. Down, down, and in a few seconds she'd be all the way down to the chaparral. Step, leap, jump, down, down, down.